Welcome to this Expert Voices event seminar on justice reform and the spending reviews. My name is Phil Bowen. I'm Director of the Centre for Justice Innovation. The Centre is a not-for-profit that seeks to build a justice system which every citizen believes is fair and effective. And this seminar is part of a series of Expert Voice events which seek to discuss key issues affecting the justice systems of the UK. They're free and open to everyone, and we aim for them to be as accessible for people from a range of backgrounds and a range of understandings about the justice system. Today's seminar is about demand that's been placed on our justice system, the funding available in that system, and setting priorities for the future through the spending reviews. They're all issues that we picked up in our report in June called System Shift, a 10-point plan to reform the criminal justice system, though obviously justice spending goes wider than just purely criminal justice, but we'll pop a copy of that report into our chat. We have a slightly changed lineup to discuss these central questions as advertised. So unfortunately, Pavan Dhaliwal of Revolving Doors had to cancel yesterday due to a family emergency. So I'm really grateful that Russell Webster has stepped in at the last minute to participate in this discussion. And for those who don't know him, and if you don't know Russell and what's going on in your lives. So Russell is a former probation officer and a full-time independent consultant and researcher and writer on drugs and crime who hosts the award-winning russellwebster.com, and the wonderful newsletter that he issues every week is really still if you want to know what's going on in justice, please sign up to Russell's blog. And he joins our wonderful panel. So he joins Cassia Rowland, senior researcher at the Institute for Government, who leads on their work on police, criminal courts, prisons and probation, and has recently written reports on prison capacity crisis and how the new government should fix public services. So please check out those reports too. And also is joined by Natalie Byrom, a research and policy advisor with expertise in the justice system reform, data-driven technologies and data governance. So it's a wonderful panel to discuss these issues. To get the ball rolling, I'm just going to do a kind of brief overview of what the spending review that we've recently had connected to the budget has just said. So I'm going to do what's always the impossible in Teams and just share some slides. So hopefully you guys can see those. You can see people nodding, so that suggests that you can. So yeah, just to kind of set the context for the discussion. So just on spending reviews generally, again, because these seminars are designed for sort of people with general understandings. So what are spending reviews? So they are a process by which government sets out public spending plans for government departments. Typically, they used to be set for multiple years. That's become less the case in the past few years. So there hasn't been a spending review since 2021. But essentially, it's a thing that sets departmental budgets. And the latest one that was attached to the budget that Rachel Reeves announced in just a few weeks ago set budgets only for 25-26. And the plan is, I understand, that there's due to be an additional spending review in the spring. Again, nice civil service phrase, the spring, not sure exactly when, to set the 2 or 3 years of budgets after 25-26. So that kind of frames the discussion and frames why we're talking about spending reviews. If we get into the real nerdy bits of this, we might use terms like DEL, RDEL, and CDEL. The slides just explain what we mean by that. So departmental expenditure limits, i.e. what Treasury sets as departmental spending limits on each department, and they are split into resource spending and capital spending, which kind of sort of means what it says. Resource spending is spent on kind of day-to-day things, administration costs, and resources. Capital spending is into investment, buildings, that kind of stuff. So if we slip into that language, I hope we don't. That's what we mean by DEL, RDEL, and CDEL. In terms of what the spending review said for justice departments, and I've picked out Home Office, Justice, and Law Officers departments. So this graph just gives us the baseline 23-24. So that's previous year, current year 24-25, and then what's been announced is 25-26. So that's next financial year. And I've just given you the overall expenditure that the departments are working to split into RDEL and CDEL. And so what we see as a general picture on that is Home Office in real terms spending is coming down. Most of that is linked to the cancellation of the Rwanda scheme. Ministry of Justice budget going up by 5.6% over the 23-24 baseline in real terms, and Law Officers Department, which includes things like Crown Prosecution Service, also going up. And then attached to that were a bunch of policy announcements. Again, I'm not going to go through this in a huge amount of detail, but sort of the overall figure, the overall headlines that the government announced were essentially money going into policing, both in terms of neighbourhood policing, and as someone who's been around this issue for years, they're also going to squeeze out loads of police efficiencies. I think every government that I've ever known has always said that. But also investments into things like putting domestic abuse specialists in control rooms, setting up new things called young future hubs to prevent young people being drawn into crime, and then announcements around things like the new Border Security Command to tackle criminal gangs. In justice, the extra investment is primarily going to prison expansion. People on the call will be at the seminar will be well aware also of doing that at the same time as wanting to do a big review of sentencing to create a more sustainable justice system. I'm sure we'll get into those issues as well, and expanding the workforce, especially prisons probation workforce, increasing Crown Court sitting days as well to tackle Crown Court backlogs. Again, the panel can get into a bit of a discussion as to whether we think that's going to happen. Law Officers Department, additional money going into the Law Officers Department in particular to pay for it, additional resources for the Crown Prosecution Service. And then finally, I just think it's worth just saying there are related announcements that may make a difference to how justice money is spent. So an investment into children's services announced for 25-26, including an additional £1 billion being spent on special educational needs and alternative provision funding. Obviously, we know in the justice system, a lot of people, in particular children, have high SEND needs. Funding going into children's social care reform, which is obviously related to things like family justice and our family court system. So again, those things might interplay. Additional spending on things like homelessness. And again, people will be aware of headlines around prisoners and homelessness, and the amount of people we release into from prison into situations in which they have very unstable accommodation, and in some cases no accommodation. And then also spending on mental health crisis centres. Again, the population that we're mostly talking about certainly in criminal justice, but wider, have higher than the general population mental health illnesses. So those are kind of what has been announced. So that's the kind of context that we're operating in. And I thought I'm just going to sort of go down the line really with the panel and ask each of them in turn to ask what's their assessment of that spending review. Are there things that they're particularly encouraged by? Are there things they are notable by their absence? So I'll ask Cassia to open up the discussion and we'll go from there.
Great, thanks, Phil. So I just want to start with a little bit of scene setting. Obviously, lots of people here are very experienced on particular areas of the justice system, but looking at kind of the system as a whole, it is in a really terrible state. And I think it says something that the police, with serious scandals, historically low levels of trust and confidence, are maybe in the best shape of all of the criminal justice agencies. So criminal courts, prisons, probation are all failing to meet their existing demand. They can't do what they have been set up to do at the moment. And rather than improving, performance has been consistently heading in the wrong direction. So that's kind of the starting point that we're in at the moment. We've done some modelling on what we think will happen to funding and to demand going forward. So I've got a slide just to show you what that looks like. Miranda, if you could get that up for me, please. I'll just start talking and hopefully we'll get a slide shortly. So there's a mixed picture when it comes to criminal justice. basically the government's focus seems to have been immediately stabilizing the situation in prisons. Great, here we go. So if we look at these one at a time, you can see that the initial couple of years, the projected funding and projected demand map relatively closely onto one another, particularly for courts and for prisons, and then we get this widening gap afterwards. So for the Home Office, it's not clear exactly how those cuts will be distributed between asylum and the policing responsibilities that the Home Office has. The government committed to maintaining existing officer numbers, but it's not exactly clear whether that will involve a real terms increase in the police budget. It's also important to remember that the national insurance contributions, employers' national insurance contributions increase that was announced in the budget will have a really significant impact on a lot of public services because they are major employers, and that impact will be very uneven across forces around the country. So we're basically expecting that police performance will at best remain stable through 2025-26. The Ministry of Justice was a kind of winner in relative terms from the budget. Again, we don't know how that's going to be split, though, across the different agencies overseen by the Ministry of Justice. So what you can see here in terms of the projected funding line is that it's the same for both courts and prisons. We've just applied that evenly across existing budgets. But we suspect that in reality, more of that is going to be spent on prisons and to a lesser extent on probation. So in fact, there is going to be a bigger gap between funding and demand in the courts than it looks like here. We basically expect this will let prisons cope in the immediate term, but performance in the Crown Court and probably the Magistrates' Court is likely to continue to decline, with sitting days still being capped, so there won't be hearing as many cases. That backlog is likely to continue to grow. And then from 26-27, things get substantially worse. So the increases this year and next year will be insufficient to turn performance around, and demand for most services is projected to continue growing. You can see that it flattens for courts, but that's really because we think there's a basically without increases to officer numbers, there's a limit to how many cases make it through to the courts. And the real terms funding is currently projected to fall about 1.4% a year for unprotected services from 2026-27. So there is going to be this ever-growing gap between spending and demand. Even if those kind of planned reforms that have already been talked about do come through, and if the sentencing review successfully results in lower demand on prisons, that's going to really struggle to compensate for such a big gap. So things are probably going to get worse from 26-27 onwards, unless funding is increased in the next spending review, which is going to be coming up in the spring. So I'll leave it there, I think, for the moment in terms of this review, and then we're going to come back and talk about the next spending review and kind of some of the questions there afterwards.
Thank you very much. And just as I guess as a health warning, we'll try and make sure there's some optimism at various points during the course of this seminar, but it may well be there's quite gloomy assessments generally. But
I thought that was quite optimistic for me,
Phil. Okay, fair enough. Over to you, Natalie. What's your assessment of where we currently are and what the spending review we've just had has said and not said?
Well, I mean, similarly to Cassia, it's not looking great, is it? I mean, and I wanted to particularly thank Cassia and IFG for all the brilliant work that you've done kind of drilling into this. It's been absolutely fantastic. So on the one hand, I think the outcome of this spending review was sort of predictable. The government had inherited a system in crisis. We always knew emphasis on prisons was going to dominate, and in some ways, sort of fixing or attempting to address the crisis in prisons before you move on to kind of looking at what's happening in the courts and further upstream makes sense, right? Because if you haven't got prison places and you're not going to make immediate reforms to sentencing, there's no real point in looking at that. And I think it's also important to note that there are some good things, like the announcement of the sentencing review, the fact that that's happening, that is a positive. Announcements on commitments to tackling violence against women, also positive. Announcements around female imprisonment, that's great. And it's, I don't think we ever thought that this spending review was really going to be the space where they would fix the foundations. This was always going to be more about sticking fingers in dams or papering over cracks, whatever Yankee sort of euphemism you want to use. I think personally, and there have been some other positive policy announcements around the spending review, but I guess what I've been concerned about is the lack of appetite for the real sort of structural changes that I think we need to see and that we have seen in other areas of policy, like what's been done in DSIT. I think I led a large review for the Nuffield Foundation earlier this year, and I think it's pretty clear that the sort of governance of the system really doesn't work. In fact, the placing of prisons budget within an MOJ rather than within the Home Office increasingly distracts attention from all of the upstream work that needs to be done. And I would have liked to seen more appetite to really look at some of those structural challenges that make it so hard to model and operate the system as a system. For my own sort of personal hobby horse, I was great to see, for the first time in years, ministerial recognition that they don't have the data to understand the Crown Court backlog. But when this has been reported, what Siobhan has said about this, she's described it as a blip rather than the persistent and systemic issue that it is. There are 47 key data gaps across the justice system that I identified, 80 key evidence gaps. And when we're talking about criminal courts, the data that we're missing is just so incredibly basic. It's data on case type, duration, complexity, plea type, timeliness data, any data that you would need in order to model the system like a system, do your proper time and motion study. That's absent. And I would have liked to have seen more recognition of this, really. There was an interesting announcement coming out of the Home Office, and I think we'll probably discuss this in more detail later, about ambitions to use algorithms and predictive programs really to try and tackle or support victims of domestic abuse and perpetrators of domestic abuse. And I am broadly, so how do I feel about this? Well, firstly, I think the desire to use technology, predict all the sort of sexy AI stuff, one would hope that anyone who was thinking of using that would encourage them to look at, the basic deficiencies that we have in data first and use that as a driver to fix some of this kind of fundamentally unsexy stuff. Of course, the risk is that all of that basic work to fix the plumbing gets overlooked, and instead what happens is big contracts end up being handed out to technology providers who then deliver solutions that undermine human rights or just don't work and make the system worse. So I think that's an area that we all really need to be sort of conscious of and keep an eye on. One thing that I would like to flag is I've been off on maternity leave, and in the middle of the night I've been reading Keir Starmer's authorised biography by Tom Baldwin, which has been really great. Really, it's a page turner. I can recommend it. But Tom Baldwin describes one of the reforms that Keir is proudest of is digitising case files within the Crown Prosecution Service, and this was music to my ears. And he also writes that you're never going to get headlines. That's not his style, but he's interested in stuff that results in speeding up outcomes, fewer files being lost, and cases getting to court quicker. So that gives me some hope that maybe there will be, right from the centre, I'm sure that's all he's thinking about at the moment, how can I complete the digitisation of the justice system effectively and fix some of these basic data gaps. So you asked for optimism, Phil. That's the optimism for me, and I'll hand.
That's good. Yeah, we like unsexy plumbing stuff at the centre, so that's great. And I do think we've been doing work as I'm sure Cassia and others have been doing on things like how to solve the Crown Court backlog, and it becomes extraordinarily difficult because the data runs out very quickly. And yes, it's not the most sexy thing, but if you don't, my partner does data and performance in an NHS trust. and the extent to which she has got data at her fingertips. It doesn't mean necessarily that the planning's that much better, but at least they've got the data to do some of the planning. So it is remarkably how different it is. Over to you, Russell, just as your sort of thoughts about where we are, what the spending review that we've just had has achieved and hasn't achieved.
Well, I am going to try and be positive. I have to say that I totally agree with everything that Cassia and Natalie said, and we can see that it's very difficult to reduce demand, which is really the government's watchword at the moment. You know, we release lots of people from prison early, that puts more demand on probation officers, and they end up circling around and going back. But anyway, I said I wouldn't go down that spot. So I don't think there's anyone would argue that prison and probation in particular are in huge crisis. And they're clearly understaffed. However, I am not sure they are as under-resourced as that. The actual budget is quite big. The MOJ spends well in excess of £1 billion, certainly just in administering the system. And we can see lots of areas of performance that are very poor, but where the funding isn't an issue. So, for instance, a lot of attention recently on how poorly we are now providing for children in custody. We spend in excess of £250,000 per person, per child in custody per year. That's not a money issue. People are concerned about the deterioration in public protection work by the probation service. That's got considerably worse. Actually didn't do too bad through privatisation. It's getting worse all the while. That's all that probation officers do. That's all they're asked to do. It's all that they're managed to do. I oversimplify to make the point. But one of the problems there is actually the way, because of concerns about that, it triggers a host of administrative and bureaucratic processes. So the supervision of probation officers are all about, have you done this risk management plan? Have you done this sentence plan? Have you done this assessment? Well, no one would say that those bits of work don't need to be done, but actually what's happening at the moment is that probation officers don't have the time to work with people to manage their risks. But apparently they have got the time to spend most of their time writing about how in an ideal world they would address those risks. So I think there is a real opportunity to take lots and lots of bureaucracy out of the system. One of the things that government, I think, is particularly bad at, and I have to say my memories of the last Labour administration was it was a real weakness of theirs, is when there's less money, people get really anxious and over-manage even more than when there's lots of money. So my assessment of the last Labour government was clearly at the time when there was lots more money. They did a really good job in identifying root problems. They did a really good job in creating quite reasonable, quite coherent strategic responses. Because there was money about, they put lots of money in those things, and then they micromanaged everything to death. And actually people spent lots and lots of their time counting the beans because they were desperate to prove that all this investment was making a difference. So that's my kind of worry for this government. But actually, I think quite a lot on the plus side, we have some positive appointments. We have some leadership. We have Lord Timpson appointed. So everyone thinks, right, you know, this is someone that understands what's wrong with the system. We have a really sensible appointment in terms of the sentencing review. You know, someone that's passionate, someone that's non-partisan, someone that potentially could do a good job at that. So I think what we need more of is more leadership and less bureaucracy. You know, the probation service is constrained by being organised in huge regions, which apart from London, Greater Manchester and Wales, have no coherence with everything else. So it's really difficult and really slow to get everything done. On the whole, lots of people in public services, and certainly lots of people in the third sector that work with these client groups as well, do their jobs because they want to. They want to make a difference. They're motivated. At the moment, we make it really, really difficult for people to convert that enthusiasm into something. We speak to prison governors, probation leaders. A lot of my day job is evaluating small initiatives. Often they work really well because they're led by someone that's passionate, committed. And when you talk to them, and especially when you talk to them about replicating successes elsewhere, they say, oh, well, yeah, but we've done this despite the system, not because of the system. You know, what's the recipe for a successful prison governor? Someone that says, no, never ask permission, only ask for, forgiveness. Essentially, we are strangling the life out of it. There aren't enough probation officers. There won't be for quite a little while. So those probation officers that are there at the moment need to feel empowered, supported to do a good job. Not that they will be thrown to the wolves if one of the very many people they're supervising at the moment commits a serious further offence. Of course, they should be doing a good job, but people will always commit serious further offences. Same as not every hospital operation is a success, same as not every child comes out with 5 A to C grades GCSE, excuse my historical inaccurate use of the qualification system. So that's where we can have leadership and say, look, we know it's rubbish, but what we're going to do is do our very best to get you more staff. And in the meantime, we're going to encourage and support and back you to do as good a job as you can. Rather than say, look, this is another problem. Can you fill in another template telling us just how bad the problem is? Yeah. That's not to undermine the fact that we do need good data, but we need data about what's going on rather than counting the beans. It's a human process and it's about human outcomes. We've got to stop counting widgets and focus on what we want to do with the work. End of speech.
Excellent. Thank you. And thanks to all of you. And I think we're sort of a beginning of obviously to kind of start thinking about, well, what are the investments and what are the priorities for the next 3 years that will be kind of framed by the next spending review. But as I think people have already mentioned, it doesn't have to be about necessary money, but it's about direction and leadership as much as it is about money. So moving forward to that sort of multi-year, I've heard certainly it could be 3 years, it could be 2, not sure, that will happen in the spring for definitely 26, 27, 27, 28, possibly 28, 29. Again, just sort of asking across the panel, like, what are the kind of key things that you'd be looking for to be prioritized within that spending review? And we'll just go through the same order, I think. Cassia?
Thanks. So we've been thinking about this, I guess, less from a kind of specific services that we think should be prioritized or particular policies that we think they should pursue, and more what are the broad questions that we have about how, I guess, the big challenges for the government and also how the actual process of the spending review is going to work. So the first one is basically, can the government recruit and retain staff without blowing its budgets massively, basically? So Labour very quickly accepted the above inflation pay recommendations from pay review bodies. That was almost certainly necessary to resolve kind of ongoing industrial disputes. Recruitment and retention are a big problem across services, but you've got a lot of key staff groups who have still seen kind of pay decline in real terms or relative to the private sector since 2010. And that is going to continue to be a pressure on budgets that they're going to have to manage. The second one is around higher capital spending. So we have seen in this budget that they increased capital spending, particularly a big chunk going to the Ministry of Justice. That is really welcome. I mean, capital investment has been a problem we've been banging on about a lot at the Institute for a while. If you've got literally crumbling buildings, really outdated IT, a lack of modern equipment, that is really bad for productivity. But the scale of the problem is really significant. We have underinvested for literally decades in the UK relative to other OECD countries. and we've got big maintenance backlogs, whether they're going to be able to kind of keep up that capital spending at the necessary level to overcome some of that really, really difficult legacy is a big question. The next is about the mission-led approach. So Labour have been very clear that they kind of want to do government differently. And there's a lot of benefits, I think, or potential benefits to the kind of mission-led approach. The budget that we've just had was a very traditional one. Individual departments kind of make spending bids to the Treasury. They then negotiate kind of individually with the Treasury, and the Treasury kind of decides who gets what. I think to make missions work, you need a much more collaborative approach to how you're funding things. You need basically pooled multi-year grants that departments have to share, because otherwise you are never going to get. So if we think about the Safer Streets mission, which is the most obviously relevant one to criminal justice, then you really need to be working across the whole system to make that work. You can't do that just in the Home Office or just in the Ministry of Justice, or even just between those two, right? You need to be bringing in education, housing communities and local governments. It's a really cross-government thing, and it's going to be hard to make that work in practice, I think. It's not what the machinery of government is used to. No one quite knows what the actual process is going to be, but I think that's going to be really important if they want to actually do things differently. Fourth question is on shifting spending towards prevention. Every government says they want to do this. Every government, at least since 2010, has in fact done the opposite. And the current crises, particularly in criminal justice and kind of declining performance, are only going to make it harder to actually shift resources away from the kind of acute stuff that's happening right now towards preventative services. And if the kind of economic environment declines, I think they will find it even harder to keep that emphasis on prevention. And then finally is around devolution. So the government has committed to multi-year funding settlements for local authorities and giving them kind of more autonomy and flexibility by bringing together kind of lots of tiny ring-fence pots that they can only spend on specific things, and kind of bringing that all together and just giving them the money, essentially. But whether that will be enough to really let kind of local decisions be made is one question, and also how that's going to interact with other services. So things like probation is being run nationally for the first time ever. A lot of people think that's not working that well. Are they going to be looking at kind of fundamentally restructuring some of those sort of sub-national mechanisms for delivery? How are you going to get those to work together? You've got a lot of different geographies, you've got a lot of different partners, and there's a kind of excitement, I think, about devolution at the moment, but the practicalities haven't yet been ironed out, and I think also the potential disruption is really substantial in a sector that's had a lot of disruption already.
And not just on that point of devolution, Cassia, I mean, the Home Office presides over policing, which is devolved and locally democratically controlled in various different ways. But it would appear that Yvette Cooper is more of a wants grip on policing in a way that, so like, have you had any sense of how those things are playing out, of sort of devolution for mayors on certain things, but in other places clearly a kind of slightly new Labour, how do we have grip and control?
I think it is definitely true that they are a bit nervous about handing control and accountability, importantly, when it comes to the police, right, over to local areas. The context of declining trust and confidence and some very severe examples of misconduct make that feel quite uncomfortable, I think. And I think probably there are real questions, right? If we look at, say, Greater Manchester Police, the inspectorate gave them some pretty poor reviews, they were put in special measures, they brought in a new chief constable. That didn't seem to be felt in the kind of local mayoral elections. Is that a sign that the mayor doesn't necessarily have the kind of tools or the ability to provide that accountability? I think it's very difficult to say, but there's a real challenge, I think, in how can we make accountability around policing better.
Thanks for that. Sorry, over to you, Natalie. Sorry, I cut in there, but I needed to explore one of my hobby horses.
No, not at all. It's fascinating, and as usual, I don't disagree with anything that Cassia said. I think looking towards the next spending review, I'd like to see us move into a place that's less reactive towards a settlement and a set of policies that are more kind of future oriented. I think there's a real risk that, you know, in the next period, if you're a small charity or an organisation and your work is on prisons or reoffending, you're going to find it relatively easy to get like a hearing and funding for what you're trying to do. But if you're working on any of the other interlinked areas, I think it's going to be really difficult to make the case. And this is going to be super unpopular, but bear with me. So this government inherited a lot of underperforming or failing IT projects, from Common Platform to the Police National Computer to, you know, the court reform programme, and lots of these have had their like vision and scope radically scaled back. This is a mistake. I really truly believe that. I really hope that the government holds their nerve, bites the bullet and fix this, because Russell's right. At the moment, and the systems that we're using, they just measure the wrong things, and it results in performance tables that don't measure anything that matters to anyone. Work that Phil, Russell and I have done together on the lack of data about victims' experience in the justice system is a paradigmatic example of that. And we need to get to a place where we're measuring the things that matter to people and policymakers. And I think that is, I can't overstate how important that is, because at present we have no source of ground truth about the system, and that makes it very difficult to have sensible discussions about any issue within the system, whether that, and particularly around sentencing, you know, the politics of that, of getting to a sensible place on sentencing, are going to remain really difficult. The Justice Committee did some polling last year, I think, or maybe actually this year, looking at public attitudes towards sentencing, and it showed that second most important to the public that they surveyed after, you know, public protection was delivering justice to victims. But what we know is that it's not just the sentencing that feels unjust to victims, it's their entire experience of the process. And at the moment, unless we're able to kind of get upstream, fix some of those sort of basic issues, the fact that, you know, you can report this, you can report like incidents aren't tied to victims in the same way that they're tied to offenders, which makes it really difficult for the police to intervene and spot when, you know, harm is escalating. That's an issue that's been consistently identified in reports that have been done on women who've ended up being murdered by domestically violent partners. Like 78% of those people had made multiple reports to the police, and the police had just never acted. Now, that's not a problem that you need an algorithm to solve. That's just like basic information management. So I'd really like to see some action on that. And I suppose, thirdly, I mean, understandably, this sort of this spending review has been dominated by criminal justice, but the justice system is much wider than criminal justice. The civil justice system, the family justice system, that affects more people. And also, you know, when we're talking about the people who fare badly in those parts of the system, the cohort, the overlap between those people and the people who end up in the criminal justice system is significant. I would like to see us in the 5 missions, which, you know, they are the things that Labour is committed to deliver against. I'd like to see us move beyond thinking about justice as just about safer streets, although of course it is. I'd like to see more kind of thinking about what is the contribution that a functioning justice system has to make to the other 5 missions. What is the contribution that a functioning justice system has to make to growth, for example? And, you know, you can draw the dots really. If you look at the Centre for Cities report that was talking about local delivery plans, one of the things that they've said that, you know, really needs to improve in order to drive sort of local growth is, you know, make places that are attractive for people to live in. If you've got poor quality housing, if you've got antisocial behaviour on your streets, that's not a place where, you know, elite graduates or whoever, like service industry professionals, want to live. And so what I think, you know, really needs to be commissioned or done sooner rather than later is a piece of work that's actually joining the dots, drawing the links between what is the contribution of the justice system to local economic growth, so we can start making those arguments. I suppose it would be remiss of me, as someone who did my PhD on legal aid, not to mention legal aid is part of the picture here. It's so difficult, and I acknowledge that it's so incredibly difficult, but we are in a place now where the criminal defence community is in crisis. It's completely unsustainable what we've been left with. Where you go from here, how you fix it, I'm not sure. It's very expensive. It's a very expensive problem to fix, and more money for lawyers is never popular. But I would like to see, you know, some clearer thinking about how we grapple with those issues. So that's just, I guess, I think that was 4 from me.
That's great. That's really useful, and I think it's. I mean, I think your point about, which is something we think about a lot at the centre, or increasingly thinking about the centre, that justice isn't just about criminal justice, and the interplay between, you know, the work that we do in family courts and the children who are in the youth justice system. Very often, even within the Ministry of Justice, the kind of mentality of the siloed mentality of these being separate things rather than joint things is still at play, and I think that sort of slightly speaks to Cassia's view, sort of comments on, if mission-led government is to mean anything, it has to be collecting people around particular things, and I don't think we've seen that in the last spending review. As you said, it's been a very traditional one. So you know, from my sources in government, mission-led government is still theory rather than practice, but hopefully that will bed in whatever form. But yeah, there's lots of complicated bureaucratic things to sort out there. Moving over to Russell, and just to say to audience members, if you want to start asking questions in the Q&A, please stick them in. I see a couple, but start preparing your questions. But I shall hand over to Russell in terms of what he thinks are kind of key strategic investments for the next 3 years should look like.
Well, I won't say too much, try and leave some time for questions, but I think the challenge is obviously that we will create more demand. You know, history tells you that kind of building prisons is a kind of field of nightmares, really. If you know, if you build them, you will fill them. You know, we've closed lots and we've reopened them. We can have a really positive sentencing review, but the kind of urge will be to make community services so condition bound that actually a lot of people will breach those and be sent to prison anyways. I think the concern around there, especially if probation officers don't have enough time to spend with them. One area which I hope will create more demand is if the government is serious about violence against women and girls, because clearly that's something that most ordinary people are really concerned about. Most ordinary people have examples in their families with their friends of that happening, and we know that if we really look at that properly, we will just unearth more and more of that. The flip side to that is actually crime is going down, and going down a lot. Most crime is going down a lot. And even though the numbers are beginning to equal out now, actually the big growth is online fraud. And online fraud isn't individual people doing that to other individual people. It's big criminal online groups. And actually the solution isn't more policing. It is mainly kind of tech, you know, protects all the things, you know, all the things that we've all fallen for, is actually making that harder and harder, and to make financial institutions kind of toughen up to prevent those. So that's the area for hope, I think, that actually we could acknowledge there's less crime instead of talking it up. I know the centre does a lot of work around diversion, and we have a really good evidence base that on the whole diversion works. But it's, again, massively bureaucratic and complicated and always being changed. And even the people charged with doing that diversion work have different interpretations of, well, what is outcome 28 or 22, and what's it this year, and what's it next year, and what are these 3 tiers of that? So there's clearly a real opportunity, I think, to cut down on that and to say, right, most people grow out of crime. If you haven't done something horrible to someone else, we will try and go down that path. We won't condone it. We won't say, oh, that's all right, don't do it again. We will try and make sure there's some sort of restitution, but it doesn't have to involve all the heavy machinery of the state, which takes a lot of time to do that, where actually most people end up getting a job, forming an important relationship, and actually, growing out of crime. So I think that's really the focus. I know politicians won't be able to say that publicly, but I think anything that looks at what are we really concerned about, yes, shoplifting's up. So what? Shoplifting's up because anyone can walk in now and scan themselves and walk out. There's ways of addressing that. It's not an epidemic of, Britain suddenly becoming overtaken by a criminal gene. It's a fact of modern life that can be kind of handled. We should be concerned about violence against women and girls, but actually, one of the things I'm always amazed about that we no longer make a fuss of, when you look at our murder rates, they compare really, really well. If you picked up the newspaper, you think we're being overrun by gun and knife crime. We're not. Again, very difficult for politicians to say when there's yet another example of a terrible individual incident, oh, it's all right, because it's not all right for the people affected and those local communities. But actually, it's very rare. So that, I think, is the area where government needs to focus on. No, we can't do everything. We can't criminalize everyone. Let's reduce the demand and focus on things that most of us are concerned about.
Thanks, Russell. So we've got a few things coming into the chat, and I want to give sort of 10 minutes for those questions in the Q&A. So I've got, this is something we mentioned actually when we were talking before the event started. Is technology and AI a game changer? Does anybody want to take that one on?
Sure. So, well, yes and no, isn't it? I mean, I think so. As Russell just sensibly pointed out, as the nature of crime shifts and adapts, and more crime takes place online in the online sphere, obviously having technological solutions to try and address some of that, or that move away from the traditional sort of Bobby's on beat model, seems sensible. And in terms of AI, I think the problem is at the moment, if you're building this stuff, in a lot of cases, you're building it on junk, because the foundations, like when you're thinking about things like predictive policing or, the hot, sexy stuff that people are interested in because they think it can remove humans from the system. At the moment, our data infrastructure is so bad, it just can't support it. And, even things like the fact that we can't pull out from our own systems, like when they were doing the rape review, for example, they couldn't distinguish between historic and ongoing rape cases within their own systems. Like when you've got such, and the way that data is collected and structured just doesn't lend itself to the type of sexy applications that I know private companies are bombarding ministers with, saying like, this is the solution to all of your problems. And so I think, there are sensible, useful things that can be done with technology, but the concern is that unless these sort of fundamental, structural, boring bits are addressed first, all you end up doing is wasting a lot of money, and you only have to look to the health sector if you want to see how that's played out. So I think, potential there, but I suppose the real potential in all the buzz around AI is that it forces attention on some of the basic, sensible stuff that needs to be fixed to make that work. My worry is when you're talking about how do you address things like culture around data collection and all of those things, that's beyond, that's not a one-term government issue, is it? And so therefore it's unlikely to be, politically appealing. I think that the issues Russell raises around sentencing, just to respond to some of that, I think it's so, when you look at countries where they've achieved a sensible position on, and one that actually works in protecting people, like the Nordic countries, what's the big variable that they don't have? They don't have the Murdoch media. Like, they don't have a tabloid culture. And I think that's one of the, that's not a solution to say how you address it, but I think there's a big challenge in all of this, isn't there, with, you know, how do you manage the politics and the policy in tandem, because it's the politics that stops a lot of the obvious things going forward.
Yeah, and that sort of links to a comment that someone's just put in the chat about public being wary of shorter or more community-based sentences, if that's what the sentencing review suggests. And I think there is a sort of, I mean, it comes also back to the point that someone made earlier about sort of governments in the past have always talked about investing more in prevention rather than the acute stuff, but how do you actually convince the public in a justice sphere that might make more sense in health and more politically acceptable in health, but what does that actually mean for the person who's just robbed your granny? And that becomes sort of more of a moral question. I don't know, so Russell, Cassie, I don't know if you wanted to come in on the data technology point, or should we move on to one of the other questions?
I've got one quick thing to say about that, which is because it seems that we've been signalled that electronic monitoring will be a big part of beefed up community sentences. And there's nothing more entertaining than reading the most recent National Audit Office report on the farragos that EM has been. And I don't get it, you know, for the best part of a decade in parts of the States, they've scrapped tagging and gone to mobile phones, which everyone has, where you can have voice recognition, they can locate you kind of geographically, etc. And you haven't got a tag on you. You haven't got something on you which says, don't employ me, whatever you do, because, you know, even if I'm trying to do a good thing, all your customers, all your co-workers will see this great big ugly thing on it. It would be cheaper, faster and quicker, but whether anyone, you know, kind of does that. So I do think there are potentials. You've only got to see, you know, how integral digital technology was to the way that we coped with COVID and what a difference it made. So emergency, you know, suddenly, oh, we can do this, we can do that. So there are lots of things where we can improve that. But you certainly beware the algorithm, you know. Yeah.
Cassie, do you want to come in on that point, or should we?
Yeah, I guess my answer in a nutshell is technology, yes, AI, no. That and the technology is the basic stuff, right? Things like police stations having laptops and computers that work and that aren't running like Windows 97, and video links into courtrooms working, so that you've not got a courtroom full of very expensive judges, barristers waiting for a prisoner to join via video link for a hearing that never happens. And I think it is much more basic stuff that we need more than it is. And I think there are good reasons to be really wary of some of the purported uses of AI as well. Things like AI written police incident reports. I have quite a lot of concerns about those, which we won't get into here. But
yeah, so sort of, I guess the panel's sort of saying yes, but in lots of areas, yes, obviously we need a system that's more updated and exploits digital technology, but it's not but at various points, especially with AI, it might be riskier and create more demand, or just not work. But given what Natalie said about the kind of structures on which it will be built, but also it's not going to come and save you if you. I'm going to try and sort of move a couple of questions together that have kind of appeared in the chat. So there's someone's asked a question about where justice institutions like prisons sit within Whitehall. Someone else has sort of said, you know, Timpson's there. Obviously got a big focus on rehabilitation. I guess maybe slightly picking up on Russell's point about leadership, like how much of that stuff matters? How much of where things are in Whitehall, who's in control, Whitehall will matter over the next 3 years? Or is it sort of all about broad structural change and growth in the economy? Oh, we seem to have lost Cassia. Anyway, we'll carry on and hopefully she rejoins. But I'm sort of just interested in your view on like how much of that stuff about where justice sits and who's in control really matters on sort of long-term planning.
I think it matters hugely. And I think the experience of attempting to deliver the court reform programme really shows us that. I also think the fact that you have prisons within the MOJ, it sucks up all of the oxygen, all of the attention, and that closes down the space for some of that preventative upstream thinking. I think it would be entirely sensible to move it back under the control of the Home Office. I also think, it would make some of the issues that we have with, data, the ability to follow individuals through the system would be improved if prisons were moved. And we moved back, I suppose, to that the Lord Chancellor's Department style model. I also think the model that we have for running the courts, whereby they're jointly accountable to the Ministry of Justice and the judiciary, but actually in practice much more, it's just dysfunctional. It doesn't work. It's strongly implicated in the huge catastrophic wastage of money that was spent on the digital court reform programme. And so I think that's something that needs looking at. I recognise that it's very hard because all of that looks like sort of navel gazing, tinkering whilst Rome burns, I guess, to the external world. But for me, having looked at this for a while now, I think actually, getting the lines of accountability right, getting the lines of governance right, that feels to me to be really important. But I'd be really interested for Russell's view on this.
Well, I know we're running out of time, but I know lots of people question what is the role of HMPPS and does it just duplicate lots of what the MHA do? And there's lots of really committed civil servants in both those institutions, but it does seem that quite often there's someone responsible for an issue within both those organisations and they work really hard to coordinate. And you just think, is there a real need for that extra layer of government?
Well, so I'm aware that we've got about a minute left and I need to wrap things up. I'm not sure what happened to one of our speakers, but I hope she's okay. We will find out that if she is. I'm sure she is. But I just firstly want to big thank you to Cassia, Natalie and Russell for their participation. In particular, again, just to underline my thanks to Russell for appearing with only 24 hours notice and being his usual brilliant self, as indeed all the panel have been. There have been a couple of things we put in the chat about reports the centre has written. We will follow this up. Oh, she's back. We will follow this seminar up with a recording, which we'll put out in our newsletter. But I think if people are interested in any of the reports and things that people like Natalie and Cassia have mentioned, just get in touch and we'll send them to you. And I hope you have a nice rest of your days. And yeah, I'm sure I shall see you all soon. So take care. Thank you. Goodbye.